The Mary Celeste, the ship that sailed without its crew. There are mysteries that disappear with time. There are mysteries that become clearer as new evidence is discovered. And then there are mysteries that seem to become more mysterious the more we learn about them. The story of the Mary Celeste belongs to the last kind. On a December morning in 1872, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, a sailing ship was moving through the water without anyone steering it. Its sails were still raised. Its cargo was still aboard. Food and water remained in the ship's stores. Personal belongings were still in the cabins. The vessel itself was damaged, wet, and somewhat disordered, but it was not a wreck. And yet, there was one thing missing. Every human being who had sailed aboard her was gone. Captain Benjamin Briggs was gone. His wife, Sarah, was gone. Their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, was gone. And 7 members of the crew were gone. There were no survivors waiting below deck. There were no bodies floating nearby. There was no obvious sign of a struggle. There was only the ship. A ship that had somehow continued sailing across the Atlantic after the people aboard had disappeared. For more than a century, the Mary Celeste would become one of the most famous mysteries in maritime history. Stories would claim that the crew had murdered one another. Others would blame pirates. Some would suggest mutiny. Some would speak of alcohol, explosions, storms, waterspouts, and even sea monsters. And eventually, the Mary Celeste would become something more than a historical event. It would become a legend, but beneath the legend is a much quieter story. A story about an experienced captain, a family at sea, a cargo of industrial alcohol, a ship traveling through uncertain weather, a decision that may have been made in a moment of fear, and a small boat that disappeared into the Atlantic. Tonight, we are going to return to not as a ghost story, not as a legend, but as a historical mystery. And we will begin before the disappearance, before the empty ship was discovered, before anyone had heard the name Mary Celeste. Because to understand what happened to the people aboard that ship, we first need to understand the ship itself. The Mary Celeste had not always been called the Mary Celeste. Years before she became famous, she was known as the Amazon. She was built in Nova Scotia and launched in 1861. At the time, there was nothing supernatural about her. A ship built for commerce. A ship designed to carry cargo across the Atlantic and between ports. For years, she traveled through the waters of the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. She experienced accidents. She underwent repairs. She changed owners. Her history was not particularly unusual for a 19th century sailing vessel. But in 1868, the ship entered a new chapter. She came under American ownership and was renamed Mary Celeste. Her life as a merchant ship continued. And then, in 1872, she underwent major repairs and reconstruction. She was prepared for another commercial voyage, and eventually, a man named Benjamin Spooner Briggs would become the captain. Briggs was not an inexperienced sailor. He had spent much of his life around the sea. He was a shipmaster from Massachusetts, and by 1872, he had accumulated years of experience. The voyage that would become famous was not supposed to be his final voyage. It was supposed to be a business trip, a difficult trip perhaps, a long trip certainly, but nothing extraordinary. Briggs would command the ship from New York to Genoa, Italy, and this time he would not travel alone. His wife, Sarah, would accompany him. So would their young daughter, Sophia. The little girl was only about 2 years old. Their son was not on the voyage. Instead, he remained at home. For the Briggs family, the journey was not simply another commercial voyage. It was also a family journey. And that detail makes the mystery more difficult to imagine. Because when we think about abandoned ships, we usually imagine sailors, professional men who understand the dangers of the ocean. But aboard the Mary Celeste was also a mother, and a very young child. Whatever happened later, the captain was not making decisions only for himself. He was responsible for his wife and daughter as well. And he was responsible for his crew. 7 men had been selected to work aboard the ship. They had jobs to perform, sails had to be handled, navigation had to be maintained, cargo had to be monitored, the vessel had to be kept on course. The Mary Celeste was not empty. It was a functioning ship carrying 10 human beings across one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, the Atlantic Ocean. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste left New York. Her destination was Genoa, Italy. The cargo was industrial. In total, the ship carried 1,701 barrels. The alcohol was intended for commercial use and was part of a valuable shipment. The ship left New York Harbor and began moving eastward. For the people aboard, the first days of the voyage would have been familiar. The sounds of the ship, the movement of the sea, the creaking of wood, the ropes pulling against the rigging, the constant wind, the changing sky, and the endless horizon. For a sailing vessel in the 19th century, the ocean was not simply scenery, it controlled everything. A change in winds could alter the course. A storm could delay the voyage. Heavy seas could damage equipment. Navigation depended on instruments, charts, observations, and the experience of the captain. There was no engine powerful enough to guarantee a particular speed. There was no radio. There was no satellite navigation. There was no emergency service waiting somewhere nearby. If something went wrong, the people aboard the ship were often alone. The Mary Celeste sailed into the Atlantic, and, for a time, nothing happened that would become part of the legend. The ship continued eastward. Another vessel, the disappearance, would soon follow. It was also heading toward the Mediterranean. Its captain was David Morehouse. The two ships would eventually cross paths. Neither captain knew that their voyages were about to become connected. At first, they were simply two merchant ships traveling across the Atlantic. The Mary Celeste had left New York on November 7. The disappearance departed later. For days, their routes remained separate. And then the weather changed. The Atlantic in November was not a peaceful place. The North Atlantic and the waters around the Azores could produce powerful weather. Wind could build rapidly. Waves could become dangerous. Clouds could obscure the horizon. A ship could disappear from sight within minutes. For the people aboard the Mary Celeste, the ocean would have been a constant presence. During the voyage, the ship experienced rough weather. The surviving records tell us that strong winds and difficult seas affected the vessel in the days before the last known log entry. But the important thing is this. There is no evidence that the Mary Celeste was destroyed by a catastrophic storm. She survived. She continued sailing. And on November 25, a final known entry was recorded. The ship was somewhere near the Azores. That entry would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire mystery, traces easty, because after that date, the written record became silent. There was no final explanation, no message describing an emergency, no statement saying that the ship was sinking, no account of what happened to Captain Briggs, his family, or the crew. Just silence. Somewhere between November 25 and December 4, the lives of 10 people changed forever, but we do not know exactly when. We do not know exactly where, and we do not know exactly why. That uncertainty is the heart of the mystery. The Atlantic Ocean. Imagine standing aboard the Mary Celeste on the morning of November 25. The ship is moving through the Atlantic. You know your destination. Genoa is still far away. The journey is not over. The captain is working. The crew is working. Sarah Briggs is aboard. Her young daughter is aboard. There is cargo below deck. There is food. There is water. There are instruments. There are charts. Everything required for a long voyage is still present. Nothing about this moment tells us that the ship will soon become famous. Nothing tells us that the people aboard will never reach Italy. Nothing tells us that the people aboard will later find the Mary Celeste drifting without them. And yet, sometime after this final entry, something happened. Perhaps the crew became frightened. Perhaps the captain believed the vessel was in danger. Perhaps the cargo created a problem. Perhaps the ship took on more water than expected. Perhaps a measurement suggested that the vessel was sinking. Perhaps the weather created a temporary danger. Or perhaps something happened that left no physical trace. We cannot know. The evidence is incomplete. That is important, because over the years people have often filled those missing moments with dramatic stories. But history does not give us permission to turn a possibility into a fact. We know the ship was abandoned. We know the lifeboat was missing. We know the people never returned. Everything beyond those facts must be treated carefully. And so, for now, we will leave the Mary Celeste alone in the Atlantic, because another ship is approaching. The disappearance was a British brigantine. She had also left New York and was traveling toward the Mediterranean. Her captain was David Morehouse. Morehouse was an experienced sailor, and, significantly, he knew Benjamin Briggs. This detail would later become part of the speculations surrounding the case. But there is no solid evidence that the two men were involved in any conspiracy. At the time, their connection was much simpler. They were fellow sailors. Their ships had left the same American port, and now, in early December, the Dei Gratia was somewhere in the Atlantic near the Azores. The crew was performing the ordinary work of a long voyage, watching the sea, handling the ship, maintaining course, waiting for land. Then, on December 4, something appeared on the horizon, a sailing ship. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it. Ships were seen at sea. That was normal. But something about this one was wrong. The vessel was not behaving normally. Its course appeared irregular. Its movements were difficult to understand. And, most importantly, there was no obvious response from the people aboard. The crew of the Dei Gratia watched. They tried to determine what was happening. Captain Morehouse became increasingly concerned. A ship that failed to respond to signals could be in trouble. Perhaps its crew needed help. Perhaps they had been injured. Perhaps the ship had suffered damage. The Dei Gratia changed course. It moved closer. The mystery was about to begin. As the Dei Gratia approached, the identity of the other vessel became clear. It was the Mary Celeste, the same ship that had left New York, the same ship that should have been continuing toward Genoa, but now she was moving strangely through the Atlantic. No one appeared to be controlling her. Captain Morehouse sent men to investigate. They approached the Mary Celeste by boat, and then they climbed aboard. What they found must have been deeply unsettling. The ship was deserted. There was no captain, no crew, no family, no one. The Mary Celeste was not a wreck. She had not disappeared beneath the waves. She was still afloat. She still had sails. Her cargo was still aboard. Her stores were still there. But the people were gone. The men from the Dei Gratia searched the vessel. They found evidence of disorder. Some sails and rigging had been damaged. There was water in the bilge. One pump had been dismantled. Some hatch covers were open. The ship was wet and untidy. But none of this explained where the people had gone. The lifeboat was missing. That was one of the most important discoveries. If everyone had left the ship, they had probably left in that boat. But why? Why would a captain abandon a ship that was still afloat? Why would an experienced sailor take his wife and 2-year-old daughter into a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic? Why would he leave behind a valuable cargo? Why would he leave behind food and water? Why would he abandon a ship that might still have been capable of sailing? These questions would haunt investigators for years. But at that moment, the sailors aboard the Dei Gratia had a much simpler problem. They had found an abandoned ship, and they had to decide what to do with it. The Mary Celeste contained clues, but clues are not answers. The ship's condition would later be examined in great detail. The cargo remained largely intact. Of the 1,071 barrels of industrial alcohol, 9 were found empty. Those 9 barrels were made from red oak, which was more porous than the white oak used for the others. This would later become important, because one theory suggested that alcohol vapor may have escaped from the barrels, but the idea that the entire cargo had exploded was not supported by the evidence. The main hatch was found secured. The cargo was still present. There was no great blast, no burned wreckage, no obvious evidence that the ship had suffered a catastrophic explosion. Another theory claimed that the crew had simply become drunk. But the alcohol aboard was industrial alcohol, not ordinary drinking alcohol, and Captain Briggs was known as a man who did not drink. There was also no clear evidence of drunken violence. The ship's valuables had not been stolen. The crew's belongings remained. There was no obvious massacre, no obvious pirate attack, no clear sign of mutiny, no bodies, no explanation. The Mary Celeste seemed almost like a room that someone had suddenly left, except this room was floating in the middle of the Atlantic, and the people who had left it were nowhere to be found. The lifeboat may be the most important object in the entire story, because it gives us a possible answer to one question. Where did the people go? They probably did not simply vanish from the deck, they probably left deliberately. The missing boat suggests that at some point, the 10 people aboard the Mary Celeste believed they needed to get away from the ship. But this creates an even more difficult question. What could make an experienced captain abandon a seaworthy vessel? A ship's captain did not simply walk away. The ship was his responsibility. His crew depended on him. His wife and child were aboard. The Mary Celeste was also his property in part. Abandoning her meant losing a valuable asset, so there must have been a reason. Or at least, the captain must have believed there was a reason. Perhaps he thought the ship was sinking. Perhaps he believed there was a danger of fire or explosion. Perhaps he had become convinced that the pumps could not keep up with the water entering the ship. Perhaps the instruments or the weather suggested something terrible was happening. There is another possibility. The ship may have experienced an event that was frightening but temporary. A sudden sound, a burst of vapor, a violent movement, a strange reading of the ship's water level. Something that caused the captain to believe the ship was in immediate danger. If so, he may have ordered everyone into the small boat temporarily. Perhaps the boat was intended to remain close. Perhaps a line connected the boat to the ship. Perhaps the captain expected to return once the danger passed, and perhaps that plan failed. If the line broke, the Mary Celeste could have sailed away. The people in the boat would then have been left behind. 10 people, one small boat, open ocean, no rescue. That possibility is not a proven solution, but it fits more of the evidence than many of the dramatic stories that came later. And it gives us a terrifying image. Not a murder, not a ghost, but 10 people watching their ship disappear into the distance. One of the strangest details found aboard the Mary Celeste concerned the pumps. One of the ship's pumps had been dismantled. Why? There was water in the bottom of the ship, not enough, according to later examination, to make the ship an obvious wreck, but enough to attract attention. A captain at sea would care deeply about water entering the hull. Water in the bilge was not necessarily unusual. Ships collected water. Pumps were used to remove it. But if the amount appeared greater than expected, the situation could become frightening. Imagine being aboard a 19th century wooden sailing ship. You cannot see through the hull. You cannot instantly determine where water is coming from. You cannot call another ship. You cannot contact the harbor. You have only your instruments, your crew, your experience, and your judgment. If you believe the ship is taking on water faster than you can remove it, you have a serious problem. And if your ship is also carrying hundreds of barrels of industrial alcohol, another danger may enter your thinking. Fire, explosion, vapor. The cargo itself may not have exploded. But a captain does not need certainty to become afraid. That is one reason the Mary Celeste mystery is so difficult. A decision made in fear may not leave a clear physical trace. The captain may have believed the ship was sinking. He may have believed the cargo was dangerous. He may have believed that abandoning the ship temporarily was the safest choice. And he may simply have been wrong. History is full of disasters caused not by foolishness, but by reasonable decisions made with incomplete information. After boarding the Mary Celeste, the men of the Dei Gratia had to make a decision. The ship could not simply be left drifting, so they took control of her. The abandoned vessel was brought toward Gibraltar. There, the case would become a legal investigation. And this is where the story changes. Until this point, the Mary Celeste was simply a mystery at sea. Now, it became evidence. The British authorities examined the ship. They wanted to know what had happened. Was the crew murdered? Had there been a mutiny? Had pirates attacked the vessel? Was there fraud? Had the crew deliberately abandoned the ship? Could the men aboard the Dei Gratia have been involved? The investigators did not simply accept the first explanation. They examined the vessel. They looked for evidence of violence. They examined the cargo. They considered the condition of the ship, and they questioned the men who had found her. The investigation lasted for months. Suspicion surrounded the case, but suspicion is not proof. In the end, the authorities did not establish that the crew of the Mary Celeste had been murdered. They did not prove a conspiracy. They did not find convincing evidence of foul play. The mystery remained, and the men of the Dei Gratia eventually received a salvage payment, but the amount was relatively modest compared with the value of the ship and cargo. That fact itself helped keep suspicion alive. People wondered whether the authorities still believed something was wrong. But no definitive crime was established. No killer was identified. No survivor appeared. The case remained open. For a while, the Mary Celeste might have remained an obscure maritime mystery, but then something happened that changed the story forever. People began writing about it. And, as the years passed, the facts became mixed with imagination. One of the most influential writers to take inspiration from the mystery was Arthur Conan Doyle. Years before Sherlock Holmes became one of the world's most fictional detectives, Conan Doyle wrote a story in It Was Fiction. But many readers treated the story as if it were connected to the real case, and the legend grew. Soon, the Mary Celeste was no longer simply a ship whose crew disappeared. It became a ghost ship, a haunted vessel, a symbol of the unexplained. Stories appeared about murder, about mutiny, about pirates, about strange forces at sea, and with every retelling, the original evidence became harder to see. This happens often in history. A strange event occurs. People do not know what caused it. People do not know. A newspaper exaggerates it, a book turns it into drama, and eventually the fictional version becomes more famous than the historical one. The Mary Celeste suffered exactly this fate. To understand the mystery, it is useful to eliminate some of the more dramatic possibilities. There is no credible evidence that a sea monster attacked the ship. There is no evidence that supernatural forces were involved. There is no evidence that the ship was attacked by some mysterious creature. There is no convincing evidence of a massacre, and there is no reliable evidence that the crew staged an elaborate disappearance. The ship was carrying valuable cargo, yet that cargo was still aboard. Personal possessions remained. There was no clear evidence that the vessel had been looted. The condition of the ship was inconsistent with many of the most dramatic stories. The investigation in Gibraltar considered foul play, but it did not establish it. That does not mean we know what happened. It means only that some explanations have less support than others, and that distinction matters. A mystery does not become less interesting simply because we remove the ghosts. In fact, sometimes the real story becomes more disturbing, because the real possibility is that a perfectly ordinary human decision may have caused the disappearance. One modern theory focuses on the cargo. The Mary Celeste carried 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. 9 were empty. Those 9 barrels were made from red oak. Red oak is more porous than white oak. That means alcohol could have leaked. If enough vapor accumulated inside the ship, the people aboard may have become concerned about fire or explosion. But we have to be careful. There was no evidence of a massive explosion. The ship did not appear burned. The cargo was largely intact. The main hatch was secured. So, the idea is not that an enormous explosion destroyed the ship. The possibility is more subtle. Perhaps there was a sudden release of vapor. Perhaps the crew heard something. Perhaps they smelled something. Perhaps they feared an explosion. A captain does not need to wait for flames before deciding that a dangerous cargo has become unsafe. If Briggs believed there was a possibility of an explosion, he might have decided to move everyone away from the ship. The lifeboat could have been launched, the people could have remained near the vessel. And if they expected to return, they might not have taken everything with them. This could explain why many possessions remained aboard. It could explain why the ship itself was not destroyed. And it could explain why the lifeboat was missing. But again, this is a reconstruction. It is not a proven answer. We cannot ask Benjamin Briggs, we cannot ask Sarah, we cannot ask the crew. They are all gone. This is the part of the story that is hardest to imagine. The Mary Celeste survived. The ship continued sailing. The people did not. If the crew entered the lifeboat, what happened next? The Atlantic, a small boat in those waters, would have been extremely vulnerable. Wind could separate it from the ship. Waves could overturn it. Food and water could run out. Navigation would be difficult. The people might have attempted to reach land. They might have tried to remain close to the Mary Celeste. But if the connection between the two vessels was lost, the ship would have continued sailing with the wind. The lifeboat would have become another small object on a huge ocean. And eventually, the people aboard could have disappeared without leaving a trace. No bodies were found. No confirmed survivor ever appeared. No message was recovered. No later sighting solved the mystery. 10 people simply disappeared from the historical record. Their names remain, their lives can be reconstructed partially, but their final hours cannot. And that may be the most haunting part of all. Benjamin Briggs is often reduced to a single character in the mystery, the captain who abandoned his ship. But that description is unfair. He was a sailor, a husband, a father, and a man who had spent years learning how to survive at sea. He was responsible for the people aboard the Mary Celeste. That means any decision he made would have carried enormous consequences. If he ordered the abandonment, he must have believed there was a reason. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps the danger was misunderstood. Perhaps the evidence available to him was incomplete. But he did not have the information we have today. He did not know that another ship would discover the Mary Celeste days later. He did not know that historians would study his final voyage for more than a century. He did not know that his name would become part of one of the world's most famous maritime mysteries. At the moment he made his final decision, he was simply a captain trying to keep his family and crew alive. And that is what makes the story tragic, rather than merely mysterious, because the decision that may have been intended to save 10 lives may have been the decision that ultimately cost them everything. There is another part of the story that often disappears behind the mystery. Sarah Briggs was not a mysterious figure. She was a wife traveling with her husband. Her daughter, Sophia, was only about 2 years old. When we imagine the Mary Celeste, it is easy to imagine an empty ship. But before it became empty, it was a home for a family. There would have been ordinary moments. Meals, conversation, the movement of the ship, the sound of footsteps on the deck, a child growing tired, a mother caring for her daughter, a captain checking the weather, crewmen working. Nobody aboard knew that their voyage would become famous. Nobody knew that more than a century later people would still ask what happened. For them, it was simply a journey. And perhaps that is why the story continues to affect people. People who expected another morning. They never got one. The mystery did not end when the ship reached Gibraltar. In some ways, that was when it truly began. Newspapers wanted explanations. Readers wanted answers. Writers wanted stories. The Mary Celeste offered all three possibilities. A ship without a crew was almost too perfect a mystery. There was a beginning. There was an empty vessel. There was missing cargo equipment. There was an abandoned lifeboat. There was an abandoned lifeboat. There was no ending. And when a story has no ending, people tend to create one. Over the decades, increasingly elaborate explanations appeared. Some involved murder. Some involved piracy. Some involved supernatural forces. Some claimed that the crew had been poisoned. Others imagined mutiny. Still others invented survivors. One particularly famous fictional account presented an imagined explanation for the disappearance. But fiction is not evidence. And the more carefully historians examine the surviving record, the more the legendary details begin to fall away. What remains is less dramatic, but more believable. A ship, a captain, a family, a crew, bad weather, a dangerous cargo, water in the build. The case remains unresolved, but modern investigations have attempted to reconstruct the circumstances using the physical evidence. One possibility is that the people aboard the Mary Celeste believed the ship was in greater danger than it actually was. Perhaps they thought the ship was taking on too much water. Perhaps the cargo raised fears of fire or explosion. Perhaps both concerns existed at the same time. Captain Briggs may have decided to abandon the ship temporarily. The people may have entered the small boat. The Mary Celeste may have remained connected to them, and then the connection was lost. The ship, still capable of sailing, continued on. The lifeboat did not. That explanation is horrifying because it requires no extraordinary event, no murder, no ghost, no monster, no conspiracy, only fear. And one wrong decision. The ocean did the rest. There is an almost cruel quality to the Mary Celeste. The ship survived. It continued sailing. It carried its cargo. It eventually reached Gibraltar. It became evidence. It became famous. But the people aboard did not survive. The Mary Celeste became the witness. And yet the witness could not speak. It could only show investigators what remained. A dismantled pump, wet surfaces, damaged rigging, cargo, an empty deck, and a missing lifeboat. That is all history had, and perhaps that is why the mystery became so powerful. The ship itself seemed to preserve the final moments, but not enough of them. Just enough to make us ask questions, never enough to answer them. So after all these years, what can we actually say? We know that the Mary Celeste left New York on November 7, 1872. We know that Captain Benjamin Briggs was aboard. His wife Sarah was aboard. Their young daughter Sophia was aboard. 7 crew members were aboard. We know the ship carried 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. We know the vessel sailed across the Atlantic. We know the last surviving log entry was made on November 25. We know that another ship, the Dei Gratia, encountered the Mary Celeste on December 4. We know the Mary Celeste was found deserted. We know the lifeboat was missing. We know food and water remained. We know the cargo was largely intact. We know the ship was in a condition that investigators regarded as seaworthy. We know the authorities investigated possible foul play, and we know they never established a convincing explanation for the disappearance. We know that none of the 10 people aboard the Mary Celeste were ever seen or heard. Everything else is interpretation. And perhaps that is where the mystery should remain. Imagine the families waiting on shore. The Mary Celeste had sailed toward Europe. Eventually, news should have arrived. The ship should have reached Genoa. Letters should have been written, cargo should have been delivered, the crew should have returned, but they never did. For the families, there was no final goodbye, no body, no grave, no certainty, only absence, and absence can be harder than death. Death gives a final answer. The Mary Celeste gave none. For generations, people could only wonder, what happened to Benjamin? What happened to Sarah? What happened to little Sophia? What happened to the 7 sailors? Where was their lifeboat? Did they die together? Did they become separated? Did they see the Mary Celeste sailing away? Did they understand that they would never see land again? These questions cannot be answered. The Atlantic kept those answers. More than 150 years have passed. Technology has transformed the world. We can cross oceans in hours. We can communicate instantly across continents. We can track ships by satellite. We can measure storms from space. We can locate a vessel almost anywhere on Earth. And yet, the people who disappeared aboard her lived in a world without those technologies. They were separated from the rest of humanity by thousands of miles of ocean. When something went wrong, they had only themselves. That is one reason the story still feels strangely modern, because the fear is timeless. The fear of being lost, the fear of making the wrong decision, the fear of believing you are safe when you are not, and the fear of leaving something familiar because you believe danger is coming. Perhaps the most powerful image in this entire story is not the storm, it is not the ocean, it is not the lifeboat, it is the empty ship. A ship that should have been full of people, a ship with a captain's cabin, a family space, crew quarters, food, water, cargo, sails, ropes, charts, everything necessary for life except life itself. The Mary Celeste continued across the ocean as though nothing had happened. The wind filled her sails. The waves pushed against her hull. The ship moved forward. But there was nobody aboard to watch the horizon, nobody to hear the creaking of the rigging, nobody to turn the wheel, nobody to wonder what would happen next. The ship was alive only in the mechanical sense. It was a vessel without a voyage, a home without its people, and somewhere behind it, 10 lives had vanished. Many historical stories have endings. Kings die, wars finish, cities fall, empires collapse, documents are discovered, graves are found. The Mary Celeste has none of that. The story simply stops. There is a final known position. Then silence. A ship is discovered. Then an investigation. Then more silence. No final confession, no recovered lifeboat, no survivors, no definitive explanation. That is why the Mary Celeste is still discovered, and perhaps we never will. The ocean is very good at keeping secrets. For centuries, sailors have disappeared beneath its surface. Ships have sunk, storms have erased evidence, wreckage has drifted away, names have been forgotten. But every so often, the ocean gives something back. In December 1872, it gave back a ship, the Mary Celeste. She was still floating, still carrying her cargo, still capable of sailing, but empty. Her people were gone. The ship eventually reached Gibraltar. Investigators searched her. They questioned witnesses. They examined the evidence. They considered murder, mutiny, piracy, fraud, fire, water. The Mary Celeste remained what she had been from the moment she was discovered. A question, Perhaps the people aboard believed they were escaping a danger. Perhaps they believed they would return. Perhaps the ship was connected to their small boat. Perhaps the line broke. Perhaps the ocean separated them. Perhaps something entirely different happened. We will never know for certain. But perhaps we do not need a ghost to make this story frightening. Perhaps we do not need a monster. Perhaps we do not need a murderer, because the most frightening possibility is also the simplest. That on some unknown day in late November or early December 1872, an experienced captain looked at the sea, looked at his ship, looked at the people he was responsible for, and believed that leaving the Mary Celeste was safer than remaining aboard. And he was wrong. The ship survived. The people did not. The Mary Celeste continued sailing without them until another crew finally found her. And that is how a merchant ship became a legend, not because it vanished, but because it did not. It remained, floating alone in the Atlantic, carrying everything except the people who had trusted it. More than a century later, we can still picture that empty deck, the sails moving in the wind, the sound of waves against the hull, the horizon stretching in every direction, and somewhere beyond that horizon, the final moments of 10 human beings remain lost. Their names survived, their ship survived, their story survived, but their ending did not. And perhaps that is the true mystery of the Mary Celeste, not what the ship was carrying, not what the investigators found, but what happened in those final moments when 10 people stepped away from a ship they believed they could still return to. The ocean never gave them back, and the Mary Celeste sailed on,